Hi, Lindenwood class. We're back to do some more Echo Mountain, and I'm going to pick up with chapter 23. We left Ellie in the cabin with the old woman who has just awakened. So here we go. Chapter 23. "You didn't knock?" she said. Her voice was dead tree dry, but her eyes were so blue that for a moment I forgot she was old. I gasped at them, at her, at the sound of her voice. It was weak and pale, but with a strong echo in it. Something that ignited a spark of memory. "The door was open," I said, as the echo faded and the spark winked out. "Your dog invited me in." At which her eyebrows went up. "Him?" She looked around, but stopped, wincing. It clearly hurt her to move. I stepped aside so the dog could take my place. "Ah," she said, "there you are." She reached out and laid her hand on his head, closed her eyes, sighed, and then grabbed the tick on his face and ripped it off with one quick jerk. He yelped, pawed at his face for a moment, and then sat still again. She held out the tick. "Put this in one of those jars over there. One of the empty ones. There, on the bottom shelf." I had no idea what to say to that. So I fetched a jar, opened the wire bail, took off the lid, and held it out so she could drop in the tick. It bounced like a blueberry. I put the lid back on and was about to lock the bail when she said, "Leave it loose. Air enough and all that blood will keep her for some time." She hadn't even asked me my name, nor I hers, yet we were talking about ticks. "But why do you want to keep her?" It was the first time I'd called a tick her. "I might need her." She closed her eyes again. I imagined her squeezing the blood from that tick, making a potion with it. Witch, I thought. She's not a hag. She's a witch. I took a step from the bed. "Don't be a ninny," she said, without opening her eyes, as if she'd heard what I'd thought. I put the jar on the shelf and then edged closer again, more curious than afraid. I had 100 questions, maybe more. I started with, "What's your name?" She paused, as if to think, as if no one had asked her that question for a long time. "Kate," she said. "Short for Catherine, with a C, and only one E." She spelled it out. "After my mother, though she was never Kate. And you?" "Ellie," I said. "Short for?" "Nothing. Long for Lee." "Lee," the woman nodded. "That's a good strong name. Simple, with nice round edges, like a pear." We ran out of things to say about our names, so I said, "Why do you have a doll?" She looked confused for a moment and then felt for the little doll and pulled it against her chest. "Why shouldn't I have her?" I shrugged. "I didn't say you shouldn't. I just asked why you did." She didn't answer, but I thought I understood. I had long since given up my own doll to Samuel, who had lost it in the woods, but I still remembered how it had felt to hold her in my arms as I settled toward sleep. "How did you hurt your leg?" She gave me a hard look. "It's not good manners to come into my home and look at me while I'm sleeping." Much of this situation was odd and surprising. That she would talk about manners was more of the same. "I tried to rouse you. You wouldn't wake up. You have fever. There's a dead rabbit next to your head. Of course I looked at you." She turned her head, saw the rabbit next to her, saw the flies. "Oh, Captain, my Captain," she whispered, reaching for the dog again. I watched him relax under her hand, watched his tail sweep the floor. "Is that his name? Captain?" "It is. But not Captain. Captain. No I." I wanted to ask about that, but dog names and bottled ticks and everything else could wait. She still hadn't answered my question, so I asked it again. "How did you hurt your leg? Did you cut yourself?" She huffed. "I didn't get this old by cutting myself." To my great surprise, a single tear gathered itself in the corner of each eye and followed the map of her face. "It was a fisher cat, a big one. It went after Captain. Got me instead." I had seen a fisher cat only once, but once was enough. Far too many teeth for a critter not much bigger than a groundhog, and sharp, like white knives. Again, as if she could hear me thinking, the woman said, "Can't blame it, really, seeing as it was not even half Captain's size and cornered against a rock face, nowhere to go." "And you got between it and the dog?" She stared at me. "Wouldn't you?" I thought about Quiet, a dog I had known for only 2 days. Not even 2 days. I would. She nodded. I thought so. As if she knew me. She peered down at her leg. What a mess. I nodded. I was about to burn it. She looked at me, startled. Burn my grubs? Which startled me too. Your grubs? Them, she said, pointing at her legs. At her leg. I made a face. I know what grubs are. But yours? You put them there? She closed her eyes. They eat only what's dead. But there's pus, too. Can they stop the festering? She shook her head. A fisher cat will eat something dead and get its mouth full of germ and then spread the germ into something else, like it did to me. I tried burdock root, pepper. I need honey to kill the germ. I thought of the hive I'd meant to raid. And witch hazel? I said. She looked at me sharply. And witch hazel, I suppose. Though that alone won't make much difference. It's honey and grubs that will save my leg. Maybe save me, if I'm to be saved. Chapter 24. I rubbed the spot on my face where the bee had stung. How much honey? As much as you can get. There. She expected me to get it, but I expected that too. It was something I could do, so I would do it. I shouldn't burn it? Your leg? And I confessed that I was relieved about that. She shook her head. We open up the wound and pack it with honey. I did not see any we about it. She could barely lift her head. Her face suddenly changed. Something's hot, she said. What are you heating? The chisel, I said, for burning you. She struggled up onto her elbows. What chisel? From over there, I said, pointing at the workbench. You put it in the fire? She pushed herself up farther. Get it out! Which I did, quick as I could, my hand wrapped in a hearth rag. The blade was black with smoke and heat. Hang it up so it doesn't warp, she said quickly. Don't lay it down. Hang it. She sounded like she might cry. I did as she said, careful not to burn myself. I'm sorry, I said. I was trying to help you. I know, she said, dragging one thin hand over her face. I know. It's all right. I watched her settle, sigh herself calm. What do you make? I said, with all those tools? They aren't mine, she said. I don't make anything with them. I wanted to ask something else, but before I could, she craned her neck and said, Oh, I would be obliged if you would bring me some water. Oh, I'm sorry. And I was. It must have been some time since she'd had anything to eat or drink. There's a spring just past the biggest spruce at the far edge of the clearing, coming out under the rock there. Not much to it, so high up, but enough. I took an empty jar from the shelf and went out into the yard, where I was surprised to see that the day was still just an ordinary spring day, night still waiting far beyond the curve of the world, that the trees were no taller than they'd been, that nothing much had changed while I was inside the cabin. Such a lot had already happened on this one ordinary spring day, so much of it extraordinary, that I felt a little dizzy and unreal as I crossed the yard and went in search of the spring, and found it just where she said it would be. She was right, it wasn't much of a spring, but when I pushed the jar flat in the moss where the water bubbled out of the rock, a pool rose and flowed into its mouth as if the jar were the thirsty one. The water was cold and clear, and as I sampled it, delicious, like poured winter, fresh, perfect. I carried the jar into the cabin. Good, she said. A girl who can tap a spring. Any girl can do that. She looked at me for a long moment. I know. With one hand I cradled her head and lifted it high enough so she could drink from the jar without choking. Her tears came back as she drank, as if the well of her had dried but was now full again. And I felt some light in her now, too, where all I had felt before was darkness. So good, she said, sobbing a little when it was all gone. I laid her head back down and smoothed the hair off her hot forehead. She asked her another of my 100 questions. Did you carve that fawn? Or that squirrel? Oh, child, if I could do that, I most certainly would. But I can't, and I didn't. Then who did? I said. She looked at me for another long moment, as if trying to decide something. If you're lucky, he may come this way in time for you to see for yourself. He. So my carver was a he. I had thought maybe so. Come this way from where? Somewhere else, she said, suddenly sharp. So I asked something different. Why do you have so many books? She squinted up at me. Let me guess. You think an old woman living on a mountain top can't possibly read. I wasn't surprised by the bitterness in her voice, but I didn't much like it. I don't think that. I just don't know anyone who has so many. Have you read them all? She looked past me at the books on their shelves. Some of them many times. I don't know if I could have stayed here otherwise. I thought about why she would choose to stay in such a place, books or not, though it was better than what we'd had when we first came to the mountain. I figured any refuge could be a home if that's what it felt like. Do you want me to help you to the privy? I said. She huffed again. Haven't got one, which startled me. Everyone has a privy. Not up here, not for me. Animals make water, animals make dirt. So do I, just like they do, in the woods. She lifted her chin, and a person who says anything about that is a person I don't care to know. She sounded queen-like. Do you want me to help you outside, then? No need. I've eaten nothing, and that's the first I've had to drink since yesterday. You have fever. I know, my bones hurt with it, but it's no mistake and does more good than harm, until it's high enough to kill me. Well, then I'll go get you the honey, and I'll come back as quick as I can. I looked at the rabbit alongside her head. I can cook that up for you before I go. She nodded. For me and for him both. The dog smiled for the first time. And I brought you a fish, I said, remembering the trout. She made a face. Why would you come up the mountain with a fish for someone you'd never met before? And how did you even know I was up here? My father told me about you. You saw him once, with a bad ear. She squinted thoughtfully. I remember him. And your dog, I thought he might be trying to tell me something. Good. She nodded briskly. A girl who can understand dogs. Any girl can understand dogs. This time she shook her head, closed her eyes. For a moment I thought she had more to say about that. But then she opened her eyes again and said in a harder voice, That rabbit's not going to cook itself, you know. So I picked it up by its hind legs and carried the poor thing into the clearing, the trout along with it. I'd butchered a rabbit before, my father had taught me how, and how to scrape the skin and stretch it in the sun to cure. This one was no different, except I was alone, and the rising wind on the mountain top spoke a different tongue than the wind down below. And that woman, Kate, was in terrible trouble. I wanted to heal my father, and I would, but I was suddenly the only one standing between that old woman and real danger, maybe even the end of her. At least she would not punish me for my troubles. I could not say the same for my very own kin. Chapter 25. I expected to be punished as soon as I got home, but Samuel was still missing, and had been for 2 long hours, so finding him came first. No sign of him, my mother said, and I could tell that she was scared. We hoped he was with you. She and Esther were standing in the yard much as I'd left them, except now they looked grim and panicky. I said I'd send him home if I saw him. I could feel them blaming me again for something I hadn't done. It felt like horsehair inside my clothes. But then I realized that this was about more than one kind of blame. Esther looked like she wanted to claw me. Why did you do that? She hissed. Why did you put a snake in with father? I stood up as tall as I could. I knew it would make you scream. Mercy, my mother said. You really have lost your mind. Why would you want me to scream? Esther said. I couldn't remember the last time she had smiled at me, but I was sure that she smiled at our father every night before she went to bed, though he couldn't see her. You think Daddy wouldn't do everything he could to help you if he heard that? I had decided I wouldn't cry, no matter what sort of punishment waited for me, but this kind of talk made me so sad that I struggled to keep my voice from shaking. If anything is going to wake him up, don't you think his Esther screaming might? My mother and sister both stared at me with less fury than before, but not much more of anything good or kind. I'll deal with you later, my mother said. Go find Samuel now, and be quick about it. But as I turned away, she stopped me again. Where are the eggs? You were gone long enough to lay some yourself. I don't have any. Then where's the fish? Esther said. And where were you if you weren't at the Andersons for eggs? I was looking for Samuel up mountain, and a dog ate the fish, I said, which was the truth, or part of it. My mother frowned at me. That mutt? What mutt? Esther asked. I saw a mutt on the path, I said. And he took the fish? From my hand, yes. He had eaten eagerly the fish steaming in the cool air, and I might have said something like that. I might have said, yes, he took it from me, and told half the truth that way, but I wouldn't blame the dog for something I had done. So I said, I gave it to him. My mother shook her head. You foolish girl. You want a wild dog coming around here begging for more food? She looked hard at my face. What in the world is happening to you, Ellie? I wanted to tell her the truth, that I was not a good town girl trying hard to tame the mountain like she was, like Esther was, that I had work to do, honey to harvest, a hag to save, a father to save, and more besides. But all I said was, he was hungry too, and if he's wild, then so am I. My mother sighed, which is exactly what I'm afraid of. After searching everywhere, including the spot by the river where we'd fished just that morning, a spot I approached this time with a belly full of dread, I finally found Samuel in the cowshed, huddled in a corner behind the manger. Quiet was in his arms. "I waited until you went in the cabin, and then I took Quiet," he said. It was clear that he'd been crying. "You were crying?" "I've been hiding here forever, and I fell asleep and got a crick in my neck, and I'm hungry, and Mother means to give your pup away, but I'm not crying," he said fiercely. "Not any more." I had no intention of teasing him, certainly not for doing something so good and brave. And in that instant I found myself thinking of how that terrible January day might have ended differently. Not with my father hurt, but with Samuel the one to be struck like a hammer on a nail, like a hammer on a nail of bone and blood, the air bursting from him as he hit the ground, his small soft body lost to a jumble of wood and hard dirt. "How in the world did you get Quiet out of there without Maisie noticing?" I said, my voice shaking a little. "Oh, she noticed, and she didn't like it one bit, but she didn't bite me. I thought she might, but she didn't." He put Quiet into my hands. "Am I in trouble?" "No," I said, tucking Quiet under my chin, closing my eyes. "But I am, for giving one of the fish to that dog we saw on the trail, and for putting a black racer into Daddy's bed." It was clear that Samuel didn't know which question to ask, so he asked three at once. "Did you give him my fish? Did the snake bite Daddy?" He scrambled to his feet. "Why did you put a snake in his bed?" I smiled. I couldn't help it. No, and because I wanted Esther to scream so loud that she'd wake Daddy." Samuel rolled his eyes. "Mother said loud noises won't wake him up." I nodded. I know. But hearing Esther afraid like that, I thought he would come back. To protect her. Samuel thought about that. Did he? I realized I didn't know the answer, though surely Esther and my mother would have told me if there'd been any change. Surely they would have greeted me with such news. "Let's go find out," I said. I didn't want Samuel to get his hopes up, but I was pretty sure that amazing things happened all the time, partly because someone hoped they would. Maisie was glad to have Quiet back. I didn't tell her how badly I had wanted to keep him, to take him back up the mountain to a place where he would be safe. I knew he was too young to leave his mother, and I knew I could not be the kind of mother he needed right now, but I was tempted to do as Samuel had done. "Here he is," I said, as I laid Quiet in the nest again, "safe and sound." Maisie licked him and pushed him around with her nose until she was sure he was all right, and then she looked up at me sternly as if to say, "Don't let that happen again." I didn't want to think about the look she would give me when Mr. Anderson came in a few weeks to take Quiet and all of her babies for his own. And we'll stop there.